The cursor blinked on the screen, a silent, metronomic mockery of Dr. Aris Thorne's inertia. Around him, his university office held the curated debris of a cognitive psychologist's life. Journals on dopamine pathways, a wilting peace lily, a whiteboard smeared with half-formed equations. The unfinished paper on his monitor was a monument to a specific modern agony. He knew the material, believed in its importance, yet could not command his own hand to type the next sentence. It wasn't a lack of time, but a collapse of will. He saw the same paralysis everywhere. In his students, scrolling through endless digital feeds instead of studying the very neural mechanisms that enslaved them. In his colleagues, publishing incremental, safe studies while privately confessing a profound lack of drive for the work itself. The universal prescription was always chemical: hack your dopamine. Yet Aris had just spent 18 months on a study manipulating dopamine precursors, and the results were a flat, dispiriting line. Motivation hadn't increased. Participants just got better at craving the reward cue, not the labor. Staring out at the rain-slicked courtyard, he realized the flaw was foundational. The field was searching for a single key to a machine that had no single lock. Motivation wasn't a substance but an emergent property, the output of a complex, layered architecture within the human mind. The mainstream narrative was a reductionist fairy tale, soothing but ultimately useless. Modern life, with its infinite choices and fragmented demands, wasn't lacking in dopamine. It was creating a catastrophic system mismatch, leaving the mind's ancient motivational software glitching, overwhelmed, and finally shutting down. This epiphany was not a gentle insight but a visceral rupture. The paper before him, fitting neatly into the dopamine hack paradigm, was suddenly obsolete. To continue would be an act of intellectual cowardice. With a resolve that felt foreign and electric, Aris highlighted the document's text, watching the blue block cover years of compliant research. His finger hovered over the delete key. This was not an ending but a terrifying, necessary pivot. He pressed it. The screen went blank, reflecting only his own determined, weary face. The old path was gone. He would have to build a new one from first principles, starting with a single heretical question. If not dopamine, then what? The lecture hall hummed with a skeptical silence. Dr. Aris Thorne stood before a sea of expectant, slightly bored faces, the air thick with the scent of old books and cynicism. This was the annual Cognitive Science Symposium, a bastion of established thought. His title, projected behind him, was a provocation: The Dopamine Deception, a New Architecture of Drive. He began not with data but with a confession. He described the universal scene: a person, phone in hand, trapped in a loop of swiping, clicking, and consuming, all while a vital task languished. The common explanation, he stated, was a dopamine deficit. He let the assumption hang, then dismantled it with surgical precision. Dopamine, he explained, was not the fuel of motivation but its scout. Its primary role was not to reward achievement but to signal uncertainty and possibility. It peaked not at the reward's consumption, but in the anticipation, the seeking, the moment when the outcome was still deliciously unknown. The modern world, he argued, had perfected the art of manufacturing these signals without delivering on the promise, creating a neurological treadmill. A murmur rippled through the audience. A senior colleague in the front row folded his arms. Aris continued, his voice gaining a defiant edge. He presented slides showing dopamine pathways lighting up not at the finish line, but at the starting block of a vague, challenging project. The chemical was not the motivator, it was the invitation to explore. The real engine of sustained action, he proposed, was far more complex. Motivation was not a singular force but a multi-system architecture, a suite of ancient psychological programs running simultaneously. The profound lethargy of contemporary life, he suggested, was not a personal failing but a system mismatch, a modern world demanding focus and long-term goals from a brain optimized for immediate survival and clear, tangible rewards. He paused, letting the tension build. He saw notes being scribbled, a few dismissive shakes of heads, but also a handful of younger researchers leaning forward, eyes alight. This was the core of his fledgling thesis. The problem wasn't a chemical shortage, it was an architectural incompatibility. We were trying to run a sleek, demanding modern software on a motivational operating system forged on the savannah. The result was the pervasive sense of willpower collapse he had observed in his office, in his students, in himself. He concluded the first part of his lecture by turning to the blank portion of the whiteboard. With marker, he wrote a single, looming question in bold, capital letters, a challenge to the entire field. He faced the silent hall and posed it aloud, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. If not dopamine, he asked, the words hanging in the air, what is it? The silence following his question was a tangible thing. Aris used it, letting the audience sit with the void of an unanswered paradigm. His mind, however, flashed back to the personal crisis that had forged this heresy. Years prior, his own research had hit a wall. He was meticulously charting dopamine responses in gamers, expecting to find depletion. Instead, he found saturation. The players were awash in the chemical, yet they reported feeling drained, empty, incapable of mustering effort for offline tasks. This was the genesis of the seeking versus doing paradox. He explained it now to the hall. Dopamine, the seeking signal, was being triggered endlessly by algorithmic feeds and loot boxes, but the corresponding action, the meaningful doing, was absent. The brain was stuck in a perpetual state of preparation for a reward that never materially arrived, like an engine revving at redline while the car remained parked. This, he detailed, was the core exhaustion of the digital age. We were drowning in possibility signals, but starved of the structured, completable tasks that the brain's older systems required to feel effective and conserve energy. He saw understanding dawn on some faces as he used visceral examples. The gamer who could grind for virtual currency for hours but couldn't file his taxes. The social media user scrolling through a highlight reel of others' accomplishments, each swipe a micro-hit of potential that left her own goals feeling vague and insurmountable. The dopamine wasn't missing, it was being misappropriated, hijacking the seeking system while the systems designed for execution and satisfaction languished in neglect. This personal research crisis had culminated in a late night in his old lab, staring at the flatline data from his failed dopamine study. The answer, he realized, wasn't in amplifying a single signal, but in understanding the full motivational stack. Returning to the present, to the waiting symposium, he picked up the marker again. The tension in the room spiked. He drew 5 horizontal lines on the whiteboard, creating a layered architecture. Then, with deliberate strokes, he began to name them. System 1, he said, writing, survival and energy economy. A beat. System 2, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. He continued, his voice steady. System 3, expectancy and goal gradients. System 4, flow and absorption. He paused, taking in the utterly still audience. And System 5, he finished, underlining it, the hijacked mind, how our environment exploits the first 4. He capped the marker. The final silence was different, no longer skeptical but thick with intrigue, with the spark of uncertainty he had just theorized. The architecture was named. The real work could now begin. The first layer of the architecture was the most ancient, a foundational system running a perpetual, silent calculation. System 1 was not about passion or purpose, but brutal accounting. Aris illustrated it through Maya, a novelist with a decade of chronic procrastination. Her desk was a monument to stalled intention. Notes for a Victorian-era mystery piled next to unopened research books. The task, write chapter 12, glowed on her screen, a siren call that filled her with a specific hollow dread. Aris explained that her feeling was not laziness, but a precise neurological readout. Her brain's prefrontal cortex, the energy-intensive CEO of complex thought, was calculating the metabolic cost of the vague, sprawling task ahead. The projected expenditure, searching for the right words, structuring plot threads, sustaining focus, was astronomically high. The brain's basal ganglia, the instinctual accountant, flagged it as a poor investment. The result was not a decision to avoid work, but a visceral, system-mandated shutdown. This was the neuroscience of mental fatigue. Every cognitive action, from deciding what to eat for lunch to crafting a narrative arc, drew from the same finite pool of metabolic resources. The brain, evolved for efficiency, was designed to conserve glucose and oxygen. Vague, complex, or open-ended tasks created immense friction, a cognitive drag that multiplied the perceived energy cost before a single action was taken. Maya, staring at the blank page, was her brain rationally refusing to initiate a project with an unclear return on investment. The willpower model, Aris argued, failed here. You cannot will yourself to override a fundamental survival circuit screaming that an endeavor is too costly. The answer was not to fight the accountant, but to audit its books. Aris's intervention was disarmingly simple. He instructed Maya to forget the chapter entirely. Her only assignment was to open her document and write a single specific sentence describing the weather in the scene. Not a paragraph, not a line of dialogue, just one sentence about the sky. The goal was to reduce the cognitive friction to near zero, making the next action so absurdly small and concrete that the energy cost calculated by her basal ganglia was trivial. The metabolic projection for type 1 descriptive sentence was a rounding error. By engineering a task with negligible startup cost, he bypassed the accountant's veto. The system was not flawed. It was responding perfectly logically to its inputs. The key to mobilizing System 1 was not inspiration, but granularity. Make the steps smaller than the resistance. When Maya later reported she had written 3 paragraphs almost without thinking, Aris nodded. She had simply tricked her brain into starting the engine. Once the car was rolling, the energy required to keep it moving dropped precipitously. The accountant, satisfied the investment was now safe and contained, had stood down. Leo's studio was a gallery of polished, joyless work. Sleek logos for fintech startups lined one digital display. Packaging designs for boutique skincare products glowed on another. Every piece was technically flawless, commercially successful and utterly lifeless. Leo himself, a graphic designer in his late 30s, sat slumped before his monitor, his eyes reflecting the sterile blue light of a half-finished app icon. He described his career to Aris as a slow suffocation. What began as a passionate love for shape, color, and visual storytelling had curdled into a lucrative but soul-crushing freelance grind. Each commission now felt like a tax on his former self. Aris listened, recognizing the hallmarks of a corrupted system too. He explained self-determination theory, the human need for autonomy, competence, and relatedness as the bedrock of intrinsic motivation. Leo's early work had been a pure expression of this, choosing personal projects, mastering new techniques, sharing his art with a community of peers. The motivation came from within the activity itself. The flow of creation was the reward. Then external rewards had entered the system, first praise, then money, then deadlines and client demands. These extrinsic motivators initially provided a powerful, additive boost. They validated his talent and paid his rent. But over time, they subtly shifted the locus of control. The why of his work migrated from internal desire to external approval. Leo recounted the precise moment he felt the change. A corporate logo he designed won a major industry award. The congratulatory calls and increased rates should have been a triumph. Instead, he felt a hollow pang. The next time he sat down to sketch, his mind wasn't on the shapes or the story they could tell, but on whether the concept would be award-worthy or marketable. The act of creation became a means to an end, the art a commodity. The joy leaked out like air from a punctured tire. Now, even on financially secure days, starting work required a Herculean effort of will. The work itself felt like a performance, a pantomime of creativity for an invisible audience of potential clients. Aris identified the psychological mechanism at play, the over-justification effect. When an external reward is introduced for an activity already driven by intrinsic interest, the brain can undergo a perverse recalibration. It begins to attribute the reason for the activity to the external reward, discounting the internal joy. The reward becomes the justification, and when it is the sole justification, the activity collapses without it. Leo's intrinsic love for design hadn't faded, it had been cognitively outsourced. His motivational architecture had been rewired to run on a currency, money and approval, that was inherently unstable and depleting. The system was now paradoxically bankrupt, surrounded by commercial success, but starved of the authentic drive that made that success possible in the first place. The autonomy he once cherished had been surrendered, piece by piece, to the very market that celebrated his talent. Aris's prescription for Leo was deceptively simple. For 1 month he was forbidden from any paid or client work. Instead, he must start a personal project with only one rule: it could never be sold or shown for professional gain. Leo chose to illustrate a children's book for his niece, a whimsical tale about a lost star. The first week was agony. Leo sat before his tablet, paralyzed not by the complexity of the task but by its perceived pointlessness. His professional mind, wired for efficiency and external validation, screamed that this was a wasteful indulgence. Every stroke felt frivolous, every hour spent a theft from his real work. The intrinsic spark was buried under years of commercial sediment. Simultaneously, Aris turned the lens on himself. In his quiet study, he attempted to reconnect with the raw curiosity that first led him to psychology. He pulled dusty undergraduate journals from a box, pages filled with sprawling, excited questions about consciousness, untainted by publication strategies or academic politics. The prose was messy, the theories naive, but the drive was palpable. He had simply wanted to understand. Somewhere along the way, that autonomous quest had been subsumed by the extrinsic demands of tenure, citations, and conference prestige. His own motivation had become contingent on external markers of success, leaving him, like Leo, proficient but paralyzed. Watching Leo struggle and confronting his own, Aris had a crystalline breakthrough. The core of System 2 wasn't just about internal versus external rewards, it was about the perception of choice. Sustainable motivation required the goal to feel self-chosen, an expression of identity rather than a response to pressure. Leo's resistance wasn't to art, but to the act of creating something that existed outside the economy of approval. He needed to reclaim the authorship of his own drive. Aris devised a framework he called identity-anchored goals. The goal must answer not "what will this get me," but "who does this activity let me be?" For Leo, the shift was subtle but profound. He wasn't wasting time drawing, he was being the uncle who creates magic. This reframe bypassed the overjustification trap. The activity became its own justification, anchored in a chosen sense of self. By the third week, Leo reported a forgotten sensation, losing track of time while sketching the star's journey. There was no client to please, no market to consider. The autonomy was terrifying at first, then exhilarating. The project began to generate its own energy. Aris, applying the same principle, defined his research not as a path to academic acclaim, but as the work of a cartographer of the mind, mapping unknown territories for the sheer sake of exploration. The external rewards might follow, but they were no longer the fuel. The system was realigning. Motivation, they were both learning, was not about finding a reason, but about reclaiming the right to choose your own. Ben's running shoes were pristine, a stark contrast to the defeated slump of his shoulders. He had registered for 3 marathons and dropped out of the training for each, always around the 12th mile. His problem, he told Aris, wasn't physical. It was a mental wall, a voice that whispered why bother until his will dissolved. Aris recognized the signature of a failing System 3, expectancy. Motivation here required not just desire, but a core belief that one's effort would lead to success. Ben's goal, the distant, monolithic finish line 26 miles away, was so vast it rendered his daily efforts meaningless. His expectancy was near zero. Aris explained the theory. For action to initiate and persist, the brain must calculate a high probability that effort will yield a valued outcome. Ben's calculation was broken. Each training run felt like a drop in an ocean, with no tangible proof of progress toward the distant shore. The system, designed to conserve energy for probable wins, was rationally advising surrender. The solution wasn't to shout motivational platitudes, but to rebuild the calculation from the ground up. They needed to manufacture evidence of progress, to make the invisible visible. They began by dismantling the marathon into absurdly small micro-milestones. The goal was no longer to train for a marathon. It was to run to the next lamppost, then the next park bench. Each segment was a completable unit, a mini-finish line. Aris had Ben create a simple visual tracker, a jar where he placed a single pebble after each completed micro-run. The physicality was crucial. The empty jar represented the journey. Each pebble was irrefutable, tactile proof of effort expended. This triggered the goal gradient effect, a psychological phenomenon where motivation intensifies as one perceives oneself nearing a clear, attainable target. The brain-seeking system, fueled by dopamine's signal for approaching reward, now had frequent, clear signals to latch onto. Running toward a bench half a mile away was a winnable game. Running toward a finish line months distant was not. Ben's mindset began a subtle but profound shift. The question haunting him, "Can I do this?" was replaced by a quieter, more powerful observation: "My effort matters." Each pebble in the jar was a data point, a brick in a growing edifice of self-trust. The visual tracker transformed an abstract future into a concrete present. He wasn't just running. He was filling a jar, completing a circuit, closing a loop. The gradient of belief was steepening. As the pebbles accumulated, his expectancy recalibrated. The system was no longer calculating the probability of a single, colossal success, but the near certainty of the next small win. And with each win, the next lamppost seemed closer, the next pebble easier to earn. The marathon hadn't shrunk, but Ben's perception of his progress within it had been magnified. He was learning to run not away from failure, but toward a continuous, self-generated cascade of evidence that he could succeed. In a sun-drenched studio smelling of damp clay and mineral spirits, Elena the potter centered a lump of earth on her wheel. Her hands, coated in fine grey slip, applied pressure with an intuitive certainty. The wheel hummed, the clay rose and bowed, her entire consciousness funneled into the dialogue between palm and form. Time dissolved. The outside world, its worries, its notifications, its demands ceased to exist. She was not thinking about pottery, she had become the act of throwing. Aris, observing her, saw System 4 in its purest expression, the state of flow. Here, challenge and skill were in perfect equilibrium. The goal was clear: shape this cylinder into a vase, and feedback was immediate and unambiguous, a slight wobble corrected by a firmer touch. Autonomy was absolute, the work was its own reward. The motivational architecture aligned seamlessly, and the self vanished into optimal engagement. Contrast this with David's morning. A tech product manager, he sat in an open-plan office buzzing with low-grade anxiety. His screen hosted 12 open tabs: project management software, a sprint calendar, Slack threads pinging with urgent queries, an email client stacking unread messages like bricks. Each notification was a micro-interruption, a fracture in his attention. He attempted to draft a requirements document, but every 3 minutes, A new demand pulled him into a different context. The work was challenging, but his skill was not being applied to a single, masterable task. It was being shredded across a dozen disparate fronts. His environment was engineered anti-flow. The goals were vague: improve user engagement, feedback was delayed and often critical, and autonomy was an illusion beneath layers of corporate process. David's brain, seeking the clarity and absorption Alina enjoyed, found only fragmentation. The result was not productivity, but a diffuse exhaustion and a profound sense of motivational bankruptcy. In his lecture, Aris detailed the anatomy of this disappearance. Flow state, he argued, was not a mystical accident but the output of specific, engineerable conditions. Clear goals, immediate feedback, a balance between challenge and skill, and a deep sense of control. Modern life, particularly knowledge work, systematically dismantled each pillar. Goals were abstract KPIs, feedback came in quarterly reviews, challenges were either paralyzingly high or mind-numbingly low, and autonomy was sacrificed to collaborative tools that created the illusion of connection while eroding deep focus. The brain systems for sustained effort, craving the immersive struggle of a tangible problem, were left starving. We had replaced the potter's wheel with a cacophony of alarms, mistaking busyness for progress. The consequence, Aris posited, was a society suffering from a deficit of optimal struggle. Without the absorption of flow, effort felt Sisyphean and meaningless. Motivation withered not from laziness, but from a rational refusal to engage with systems designed to prevent deep engagement. The path forward, therefore, was not to seek more willpower, but to become deliberate architects of disappearance. It meant ruthlessly designing environments, physical, digital, and temporal, that protected the conditions for flow. It was a radical act of system redesign, carving out uninterrupted time, defining crystal-clear micro-tasks, silencing the endless ping of possibility. The goal was not to do more but to disappear into doing, allowing the layered systems of the mind to finally and joyfully align. The final layer of the architecture was not a natural system, but a parasitic one. System 5 represented the hijacking of the first 4 by a designed environment. In a stark, darkened lecture hall, Aris presented the damning synthesis. Graphs and heat maps glowed on the screen behind him, illustrating not brain activity, but the deliberate engineering of digital platforms. Each curve and peak mapped perfectly onto the motivational vulnerabilities he had just spent weeks detailing. The room grew cold with the implication. He introduced Sam, a 17-year-old with aspirations of becoming a software engineer. A year prior, Sam had spent evenings working on coding tutorials, experiencing the gentle gradient of belief as he built simple programs. His motivation was a fragile but functioning blend of intrinsic curiosity and the clear expectancy of skill acquisition. Then a popular multiplayer game entered his life. Its mechanics were a masterclass in exploitation. Variable reward schedules, random loot drops, unpredictable wins, perfectly mimicked dopamine's craving for uncertainty, hijacking System 1's energy calculus by making the next match feel like a low-cost, high-potential gamble. The game's extrinsic rewards, badges, rankings, cosmetic items, systematically overwrote Sam's intrinsic drive to code, triggering the overjustification effect on a grand scale. His autonomy vanished into the compulsion to grind. Worse, the game and social media fragmented his attention into incoherent shards, making any state of flow impossible. The clear goal of learning a programming language was replaced by a nebulous cloud of micro-goals. Complete the daily quest, check the new post, respond to the tag. Sam's expectancy was shattered. Effort in the real world no longer felt tied to success because the digital world offered success in cheap, intermittent bursts that required little sustained effort. Aris showed neurological studies indicating dopamine receptor desensitization from such constant, low-grade stimulation. Sam wasn't depressed, he was desensitized. The seeking system was burned out from overuse, leaving the doing systems inert. His motivation for real-world achievement didn't fade, it was actively eroded, replaced by a conditioned pull toward environments that offered the illusion of productivity and reward without the substantive struggle. Aris called this motivational hijacking. It was the coordinated exploitation of the mind's entire motivational stack. Platforms drained the energy account with infinite scroll, corrupted autonomy with social validation loops, shattered expectancy with unpredictable feedback, and annihilated flow with perpetual interruption. Sam's story was not one of personal failing, but of a brain operating exactly as designed within a supernormal environment that had cracked its code. The teenager sat in his room, his potential for deep work permanently fragmented, his drive for tangible achievement supplanted by a haunting sense that real effort was pointless when simulated rewards were so effortlessly available. The architecture built for survival and mastery had been turned against itself, Aris let the grim portrait of Sam settle over the audience. This was not an isolated pathology but a societal default. The feeling of laziness, he argued, was often a rational system response to a hijacked environment. The brain, running its Paleolithic operating system, was being fed inputs it never evolved to process. The constant, low-stakes uncertainty of notifications, the extrinsic rewards of likes and followers, the fractured goals of multitasking, these were supernormal stimuli, cracking the motivational architecture's code and redirecting its output toward empty engagement. People weren't failing to motivate themselves. They were trying to run a sleek, demanding modern life on software optimized for tangible threats, clear rewards and focused, survivable tasks. The psychological cost was a collective depletion. The very word laziness became a moral indictment for a neurological reality. Systems overwhelmed by contradictory signals, conserving energy because the environment offered no clear path to worthwhile expenditure. Sam's experience was the canary in the coal mine. When real effort feels futile because simulated achievement is so readily available, the motivational stack defaults to a low-power mode. The seeking system, burned out on cheap uncertainty, stops scanning the horizon for meaningful challenges. The energy accountant blocks major investments. The autonomy circuits, rewired for external validation, cease generating internal goals. The expectancy module, receiving no clear feedback, stops calculating odds. The flow state becomes an impossible relic. Confronting this systemic hijacking required more than individual willpower. It demanded a counter-design. Aris turned to a fresh slide, unveiling his integrated rebuild framework. It was a deliberate step-by-step plan to intentionally redesign one's environment and habits, not by fighting the brain's architecture, but by aligning with it. The first step was an energy audit, identifying and ruthlessly reducing cognitive friction in one's physical and digital spaces, making the next right action frictionless. The second was identity re-anchoring, defining goals not by external metrics but by the internal question, who do I want to become through this action? The third was gradient engineering, breaking monolithic aims into visible pebble-in-the-jar milestones to rebuild expectancy. The fourth was flow fortification, carving out sacred, uninterrupted time for deep, challenging work. The framework was a blueprint for reclamation. It accepted that the modern world was a minefield of hijacks and instead taught deliberate navigation. The goal was not to reject technology, but to use it with intention, to build environments where the natural motivational systems could boot up cleanly. Aris concluded by returning to his opening hook, the universal struggle of will. The problem was never inside the person, it was in the fit between the person and their world. Laziness was often the brain's logical response to a rigged game. The solution was to stop playing that game and design a new one where the ancient OS could finally run the modern software without crashing. The feeling of drive would not be a spark to be found, but a system output to be engineered. Aris's lab, once a cluttered monument to scattered inquiry, now hummed with a new kind of quiet purpose. He was applying his own framework, becoming the architect of his environment. The first step was the energy audit. He removed the low, groaning chair that promoted slouching and replaced it with a standing desk. He used a single monitor instead of 3, reducing visual fragmentation. All browser tabs unrelated to his current writing task were closed. The cognitive friction of where to look or what to work on next was engineered to near zero. The brain's energy accountant, surveying this clean, singular workspace, calculated the cost of starting his new manuscript as minimal. The system approved. Next, identity re-anchoring. He wrote his goal not as publish a groundbreaking paper, but as I am a cartographer mapping the mind's hidden terrain. This shifted the motivation from the extrinsic reward of academic acclaim, a hijackable variable, to an intrinsic expression of self. The work became an act of being, not a means to an end. Each sentence was another contour line on his map, inherently valuable. This anchored system too against the siren call of external validation. Then flow fortification. He scheduled a 3-hour block each morning, his phone in a timed lockbox, email client shut down, door sign reading, deep cartography in progress. He defended this time with the ferocity of a survival instinct. Within this protected space, he engineered the conditions Elena the Potter enjoyed. A clear micro-goal, write 500 words on System 3's neural correlates, immediate feedback, the growing word count, and a challenge perfectly matched to his skill. The state of disappearance began to return, time bent. The work ceased to be work and became absorption. He checked in with his case studies, finding tangible proof of system realignment. Maya had written 40 pages of her novel by committing to being the person who writes one weather sentence each morning. The trivial startup cost consistently tricked her energy accountant, and momentum carried her forward. Leo had finished the star book for his niece, and more importantly, had begun integrating playful, non-commercial sketches into his daily routine, not as a separate project but as a reclaimed part of his identity. The overjustification effect was loosening its grip. Ben's jar was overflowing with pebbles. His training was no longer a grim march toward a distant marathon, but a daily collection of evidence. His expectancy was now a solid, internalized belief. Effort yields visible progress. Aris surveyed these results not with triumph but with quiet validation. The framework worked because it was not a hack but a harmonization. Motivation wasn't about forcing a recalcitrant self into action. It was about designing a world compatible with the brain's ancient, layered architecture. It was the deliberate engineering of an intention engine, an environment where the natural systems of energy economy, autonomy, expectancy, and flow could align without interference. The feeling of drive was not something to be found or manufactured. It was the logical output of a system finally running in its native language, responding to clear signals, tangible progress, and self-chosen meaning. The engine, once seized by friction and hijacks, was now purring. The hall was a cathedral of focused silence. On stage, Aris stood not as a lecturer but as a guide returning from a long expedition. The journey was complete. He had led them from the collapse of will through the five-layer architecture into the heart of the hijack, and out again with a blueprint for rebuilding. Now he offered the final map. He summarized without slides, his voice a calm, clear channel. The feeling of laziness, he reiterated, was almost never a character flaw. It was a system report, a logical output. The brain's ancient motivational architecture, the energy accountant, the autonomy seeker, the expectancy calculator, the flow engine, was simply responding to the inputs of a modern world that had become a hall of mirrors. When effort feels futile, the system conserves energy. When autonomy is outsourced, the system disengages. When goals are invisible, the system stops calculating. When attention is fragmented, the system refuses absorption. The machine was working perfectly. It was the environment that was broken. He revisited the case studies not as problems solved, but as systems realigned. Maya's procrastination was an energy calculation, corrected by granularity. Leo's burnout was an autonomy paradox, healed by identity. Ben's quitting was an expectancy failure, rebuilt by gradients. Sam's hijacked mind was a warning of a world designed to exploit every vulnerability. The rebuild framework was the counter-design, a manual for becoming the architect of one's own cognitive environment, making it legible to the old software of the mind. Aris paused, letting the integrated theory settle in the hushed space. He saw nods of recognition, the subtle shift in posture that signaled not just understanding but a change in perspective. This was the true outcome, not a set of tips but a new lens. A way to see one's own struggles not as personal failures but as system mismatches. To look at a moment of inertia and ask not why am I so lazy, but which system is blocked, what input is missing. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his final words measured and deliberate. So we arrive at the end of our map and thus at the beginning of the real work. The question you brought here, how do I motivate myself, is the wrong question. It assumes motivation is a substance you lack, a ghost in the machine you must chase. He shook his head slowly, a faint, knowing smile touching his lips. The real question, the only question that matters now is this. What system am I running? The curiosity loop closed, not with an answer but with a deeper, more fertile inquiry. He teased the horizons beyond, how this architectural lens might apply to memory, to identity, to the very sense of self. Then with a simple nod he turned and walked off the stage, leaving the silence behind him, now charged with a new kind of potential. The framework settled in the room, not as a theory to be debated, but as a tool to be used. A lens through which every human struggle for drive could be seen clearly, not as a mystery of will, but as a mechanics of design.